Hey everyone. Welcome back to Hoa Karen Stories. It's great to have you with us again. I've got a real head-turner of a story for you today. What would you do if the Hoa president blocked emergency services from helping your loved one in a life or death situation? Would you take matters into your own hands? Well, that's exactly what happened to our protagonist in today's story. Let's dive in and find out how it all unfolded. The day started like any other. But it quickly turned into a nightmare. John's wife, Sarah, suddenly gripped her chest. Her face pale with pain. Panic surged through him as he recognized the signs of a heart attack, something she had experienced before. He immediately dialed 911. His voice shaky but urgent as he explained the situation. The operator assured him that help was on the way. As he rushed to comfort Sarah, he heard the sirens approaching. Relief washed over him. But it was short-lived. He stepped outside to see the ambulance coming down the street, only to watch it come to a complete stop at the gate of their Hoa community. John's heart sank. He knew that to get into the neighborhood, someone had to open the barrier. And typically, it was Karen, the Hoa president, who was manning the gate. He sprinted toward the gate, yelling, "Open it! My wife's having a heart attack. She needs help. Now." Karen stood on the other side, arms crossed. Her usual smug expression plastered across her face. "No. No. No. This is against the rules," she said, her tone condescending. John couldn't believe it. "What do you mean? Against the rules? My wife's life is at risk." Karen raised an eyebrow. "Sirens are too loud. And that ambulance is too big. It violates our community's noise regulations. I can't let them in." John's jaw dropped. "Are you serious? This is an emergency," the EMTs shouted from the other side. "Mom, we need to get through. This is a medical emergency. You have to let us in." Karen stood firm, unfazed. "The bylaws are clear. No flashing lights or sirens. You'll have to turn them off." John was furious. He shouted at her, "You can't be this heartless. Let them through, now." The EMTs, at their wits' end, turned off their lights and sirens in an attempt to appease her. But Karen was still unmoved. "Not enough? You'll need to back up." John was beside himself. "You're literally putting my wife's life at risk. What kind of monster are you?" But Karen wasn't budging. "Rules are rules, sir." Frustrated and desperate, John turned, grabbed the stretcher himself, and shouted at the EMTs to follow him. "We'll walk to the house. Just follow me. My wife's life is on the line." He sprinted down the driveway, heart pounding, knowing that every second counted. The EMTs grabbed the stretcher and rushed behind him. But the damage had been done. Every moment wasted at that gate could have been the difference between life and death. John's mind raced as he bolted down the driveway, his heart pounding in his chest. Every step felt heavier, every second more critical. He could hear the EMTs shouting behind him, their voices strained and panicked. He didn't look back. His only focus was getting to Sarah, who was still inside the house, barely conscious and clutching her chest. "Stay with me, honey," he whispered under his breath, pushing himself harder. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through him. But it wasn't enough to calm the storm in his mind. He couldn't believe Karen was standing there, blocking the ambulance, not caring one bit about his wife's life. He had never been so angry in his life. He reached the front door, slamming it open. "Sarah," he yelled, his voice tight with panic. Sarah looked up at him weakly, barely able to open her eyes. "John? I'm scared," she gasped, her breath shallow. "Don't worry. Help is here. Just hang on," he said, kneeling beside her, taking her hand. "They're coming. You're going to be okay." The EMTs arrived at the door, rushing in with the stretcher. They didn't waste any time, carefully lifting Sarah onto it. And John followed them as they rushed out the door. The sound of the ambulance siren started up again as they loaded her inside. But John barely heard it over the pounding in his head. His gaze locked on Karen's face, still standing by the gate, watching them with an unsettling calm. "You should be ashamed of yourself," John yelled, his voice cracking with anger. Karen didn't respond. She just stood there, watching them leave, her cold, indifferent stare digging into him like a knife. John wanted to scream, to make her understand the danger she had put his wife in. But he couldn't afford to waste any more time. The ambulance sped off. But John's thoughts were a whirlwind. He followed them in his car, feeling helpless. The hospital was only a few miles away, but it felt like an eternity. The minutes dragged on like hours as his mind raced with images of Sarah's frail body, her life hanging in the balance. When they arrived, doctors and nurses rushed Sarah inside. But John was left standing in the waiting room, pacing, filled with anxiety. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor finally approached him. "Mr. Miller, your wife is stable, but we've had some complications due to the delay. Her heart stopped once during transport, but we were able to restart it. Thankfully, she's still with us. But it's going to be a long road to recovery." John's heart sank. He let out a shaky breath, finally allowing himself to collapse into a chair. His wife was alive. But it could have been so different if they hadn't been delayed. If Karen hadn't stopped the ambulance at the gate, Sarah might not have suffered those complications. The guilt and anger gnawed at him. But he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Karen's actions had almost cost his wife her life. And he wasn't going to let her get away with it. He would make her pay for what she had done. But first, he had to focus on getting Sarah the care she needed to recover. The days following Sarah's hospitalization were a blur of doctor visits, medical tests, and late-night worries. As much as John tried to focus on his wife's recovery, his anger toward Karen and the Hoa president's reckless interference gnawed at him. Every time he saw Sarah weak and fragile, his fury swelled. He knew he couldn't let this slide. Someone had to be held accountable for the delay that had nearly cost his wife her life. One morning, as he sat in the hospital room watching Sarah rest, he picked up the phone and dialed a lawyer's number. His hands shook, but his resolve was clear. When the attorney picked up, John didn't waste time. He explained everything: how the ambulance had been blocked at the gate, how Karen had refused to let them in, and how the delay had caused Sarah to suffer complications. The lawyer was shocked. "John, I'm sorry this happened to you. It's not legal for an Hoa to prevent emergency services from entering a community. Those bylaws Karen is citing, they're illegal. Emergency vehicles have the right to enter, no matter the community rules." John's heart raced with a mix of relief and determination. "So, you're saying I have a case?" "Absolutely," the lawyer replied. We can sue the Hoa for negligence. And if you want, we can also sue Karen personally for her actions. You're entitled to compensation for the medical bills, the stress, and the harm this has caused your family. I can start drawing up the paperwork right away. With the lawyer's confirmation, John felt a surge of confidence. He wasn't going to let Karen get away with what she had done. He needed to fight not only for Sarah's recovery but also for justice. He spent the next few days gathering every detail, writing down everything he could remember from the day of the incident, the exact times, the conversations, the moments when he had seen Karen refuse the ambulance entry. He wanted to make sure they had a solid case. The day the lawsuit was filed, John sat down with his lawyer to go over the specifics. This is about more than just the medical bills. It's about the stress, the trauma that Karen's actions caused. She endangered my wife's life. I'm demanding full compensation. If she wants to continue running that Hoa, she needs to learn that her decisions have consequences. The lawyer nodded in agreement. We're going to hit them hard. This isn't just a case of bad bylaws, it's about Karen's abuse of power. She needs to understand that no one is above the law. As the paperwork was officially filed, John felt a sense of purpose. He had to fight for Sarah, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make Karen and the Hoa pay for their negligence. The legal battle had just begun. But John knew that with his lawyer's support, they had a good chance of winning. The Hoa, meanwhile, was already starting to feel the pressure. Word of the lawsuit spread, and the Hoa board members began scrambling to figure out how to handle the situation. Karen, who had once been untouchable in her position, now faced the very real threat of not only losing the case but also damaging the reputation of the entire Hoa. The tables were turning, and John could see that justice was finally within reach. As the days dragged on, the legal battle intensified. John's lawyer worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, building the case, and making it clear to the Hoa that they were not going to back down. The news of the lawsuit spread quickly throughout the community, with neighbors whispering about Karen's actions. The Hoa, once a powerful entity in the neighborhood, found itself on the defensive. Karen, who had once walked around the neighborhood with a smug sense of superiority, was now under scrutiny. The Hoa board, fearing the financial repercussions of a prolonged court case, began to panic. They knew that fighting in court would be costly and that losing could bring irreparable damage to their reputation. After several tense meetings behind closed doors, the Hoa reached out to John's lawyer with an offer to settle. John's phone buzzed late one evening with a message from his lawyer. They want to settle. They're offering to cover all your medical bills and compensation for the stress. They're also willing to negotiate for you to drop the charges against the Hoa. But they want to avoid court at all costs. John stared at the screen, conflicted. The offer was tempting, and it would bring an end to the case. But then, he remembered Sarah, the pain she had gone through, and how much more could have happened if they hadn't gotten help in time. He wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. No. He replied firmly. I'm not dropping anything. This is about accountability. They need to understand that Karen's actions were unacceptable. The next day, John's lawyer informed him that the Hoa had made another decision. The pressure had been too much to handle, and they had agreed to pay for all medical expenses. However, there was still the matter of Karen. John's lawyer had filed separate charges against her for preventing emergency services from entering the community. The police were investigating. And Karen was facing serious charges for her refusal to allow the ambulance through the gate. Meanwhile, Karen's world was falling apart. The Hoa, with all its finances now tied up in the settlement, was crumbling. With no funds left to operate and no leadership to guide it, the Hoa had no choice but to dissolve. It was a bitter defeat for Karen, who had spent years ruling the neighborhood with an iron fist. No longer could she control the lives of the residents. Nor could she wield the power she had once taken for granted. In the final stages of the settlement, Karen was informed by the board that her position as president was no longer available. Effective immediately. "Karen? You're relieved of your duties," one of the board members told her coldly, handing over the official notice. Karen's face turned crimson with fury. But there was nothing she could do. The Hoa was no longer under her control. The following week, Karen was seen moving out of her office in the Hoa building. She walked out with her head held high, but her eyes betrayed the humiliation she was feeling. John caught a glimpse of her as she passed by. But he didn't feel sorry for her. He didn't have time for sympathy. She had nearly killed his wife. And now, she was finally facing the consequences. Karen disappeared from the neighborhood as quickly as she had come. The once feared Hoa president was now a shadow of her former self, no longer holding power over anyone. John couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as he watched her leave, knowing that justice had been served, and that Sarah's future was no longer threatened by Karen's cruelty. In the end, the community began to heal. With Karen out of the picture, things slowly returned to normal. But John would never forget the nightmare she had caused. The Hoa was dissolved, and the neighbors began to rebuild a sense of unity. As for John, he could finally breathe a little easier, knowing that not only had his wife recovered, but the monster who had endangered her was no longer in charge. The court ruling was in. The legal battle that had consumed John's every waking moment, the months of stress, anger, and heartache, had finally come to an end. The settlement was larger than he had expected, his medical bills were fully covered, and the compensation for the emotional trauma his family had endured was substantial. The Hoa had paid the price. And more importantly, Karen had lost everything. John sat in his living room, his eyes fixed on the paper in his hands, the final court document that confirmed Karen's removal from power. As he read the verdict again, a sense of relief washed over him. His heart had been heavy with worry for months. But now, with Karen out of the picture, he felt as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Sarah was sitting beside him, recovering steadily. Her strength was slowly returning, and she no longer needed constant care. Though John still took every chance to dote on her, making sure she was comfortable and happy. They had come through the storm, and they were stronger for it. "I can't believe it's over," Sarah said softly, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper in his hands. John looked at her, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "It is. And Karen's gone for good. No more rules to control us. No more worrying about what she might do next." He leaned back, letting the quiet comfort of their home settle around them. He couldn't help but reflect on how close he had come to losing her. How close Karen's actions had brought them to disaster. But now, with Karen out of the Hoa, the neighborhood was starting to feel like home again. No one would have to live in fear of arbitrary decisions or power-hungry individuals anymore. "I'm just glad you're okay," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's what matters most." Sarah squeezed his hand. her smile warm. "I know. And I'm so grateful you fought for me. You fought for both of us." John didn't need anything more. The sense of victory wasn't just in the lawsuit, it was in knowing that Karen would never again have the power to control anyone's life. She was gone. Out of the neighborhood. Her position of power dissolved. And with it, her toxic influence. As the weeks passed, the Hoa was dissolved for good. And a new community board was formed, one that truly cared about the well-being of the residents. Not just rules for the sake of control. The tension that had once gripped the neighborhood began to fade, replaced by a renewed sense of camaraderie among neighbors. People were more open with one another, more willing to lend a hand. And for the first time in a long while, John could breathe easy. When John thought of Karen, he no longer felt anger, but rather a quiet sense of justice. She had been held accountable for her actions, and the community had emerged stronger without her. Karen was no longer part of the neighborhood. She no longer held any power. And that fact alone made John's heart swell with satisfaction. The ordeal had been long and painful. But in the end, they had triumphed. As the days grew warmer, John and Sarah spent more time together, enjoying the peace they had fought so hard to reclaim. They knew that their future was now secure, and no one could ever take that away from them. The story had a clear ending. Karen had lost, and they had won. And with that, the community could finally heal.